Hello and welcome to Module 1 of Parent Success Principles. My name is Robert McPhee. I'm your host for this course, and I share your commitment to preparing our children to thrive in the high stress, high pressure, and fast changing world in which they are living, in which they are headed out into. This is Module 1 of our course. It is arguably the single most important module of the course, and if not the most important, it's certainly the most foundational in the sense that if you don't really get and embrace this first module, then really the rest of the things we're going to talk about over the next 6 weeks won't make nearly the difference that it could potentially make. And as a result, we've kept this first module very simple. We've kept it to be something that'll be super easy to implement for you and really easy to put into action and start experimenting with, not have it just be information that's interesting to you, but having it be something that really gets implemented into your life. So the content of this first module is around the topic of personal responsibility. You've heard from me a brief introduction. You know that I used to be the director of training for Jack Canfield's company. Jack is the author of an amazing book called The Success Principles. He's best known for his work with the Chicken Soup for the Soul book series. But what I always tell people is that what Chicken Soup for the Soul really is it's a perfect example of two people, Jack and his partner Mark, implementing the principles in his other book, The Success Principles, every step of the way. The Success Principles is 64 principles. It's a real thick book. I actually call it the encyclopedia of personal development. And the number one principle in the book, the number one principle that all of the other principles are built on, is the principle of personal responsibility. The idea that it is critical for us to take personal responsibility for all of the results, all of the outcomes, all of the experiences that are showing up in our lives. And if we're not willing to do that, then the rest of the results that we really want to have showing up in our lives, chances are that's not going to happen. And if we're willing to do that, it's going to fundamentally change our relationships and our results. And again, in terms of all of the things that we could be mentoring and modeling, keeping in mind that this course is really focused on a mentoring and modeling approach, of all of the things that we could be mentoring and modeling, arguably the single most important is this issue of personal responsibility. And one of the things that I love about the way that Jack approached this was that he had a very simple formula that he taught me about how to get a full grasp, how to really understand this idea of personal responsibility, what it really means, and how to implement it into our lives. And the formula goes like this. The formula is E plus R equals O. And the E in this case stands for the events in our lives. The R stands for our response to those events. And the O is for the outcomes that show up in our lives. So E plus R equals O. The events plus our response to those events determines the outcome. And the real insight, the real powerful concept that's available in this simple formula is the fact that ultimately, in order to get the outcomes we want in our lives, it's important not to look for the events to change, because chances are the events in our lives, the weather, the political climate, the business climate, our friends, our family, whatever it might be, all of the events that we're surrounded by, chances are they're not going to change. But what we can change is our response to those events. And if we have a commitment to getting a different kind of outcome, it's looking at our response where our real point of power is. And again, if we can model this for our children, if we can demonstrate this and make it clear to our children, we're setting them up to live a life where they're creating the outcomes that they want. And in the circumstances and situations where they may not be getting the outcomes they want, we're giving them a powerful formula, a simple strategy that they can use, that they can see works in order to create the outcomes that they really want. So again, to be clear, the events in our lives is what we call the world is worlding. You know, the world is doing what the world does. It's the things that are happening around us every single day. It's that high stress, high pressure, fast changing world that we live in. And that's really not going to change. We said from the very beginning that this course is designed to help us as parents to better prepare our children to be able to thrive in that high stress, high pressure, and fast changing world. We're not intending to change that external world, because that would literally be going against this very formula that we're looking at right now. That would be like trying to change the events. What we're doing is we're focusing on our ability to respond, responsibility. And that is the key to being able to create the outcomes, the results that we really want. So there's a couple of keys in terms of making this happen, in terms of watching out to see whether it is happening in our lives. The number one thing, and these are all things you'll find that you see very regularly in the world around you, is that in order to live a life where we're taking full responsibility for what happens to us and taking full responsibility for the outcomes that are showing up, it's important that we say no to blame. It's time to stop blaming other people or other circumstances for the results that are showing up in our lives. And the degree to which we're willing to say no to blaming is the degree to which we're taking 100% responsibility for what's happening in our lives. Number two is similar, but slightly different in the way it's directed, and that's called no more shaming. And what we mean by shaming is really blaming ourselves. We see many people who are beating themselves up mercilessly, in some cases, being so hard on themselves. But the reality is we're all doing the very best we can with the awareness, skills, and knowledge that we have. And if we're willing to stop beating ourselves up and start focusing on changing But the reality is, if we're willing to stop beating ourselves up, stop being so hard on ourselves, and start being willing to focus on moving forward and changing our responses to the events that are happening in our world, is the degree to which we're going to be able to create more of the results that we want. So number two is no more shaming, no more beating up on ourselves, no more blaming ourselves. Number three is no more excuses. Again, we see this as almost epidemic in our world, where we see people making excuses. This is very similar to blaming, but it's really looking at the circumstances and situations around us more than the people around us, and blaming the economy, or blaming the politicians, or blaming our spouse, or blaming our children, or blaming our teachers. These are the excuses that we see that people are making. So if we're going to take 100% responsibility for the results that show up in our lives, we're going to have to make a commitment that there's no more excuses, and really start paying attention to whether we are living a life where we consistently make excuses. Number four is no more complaining. Complaining is just an expression of all these things that aren't working. Complaining in many ways is like negative goal setting. It's like asking for more of what we don't want. And if we find ourselves complaining, again, we're complaining not about our response, our ability to respond. Chances are we're focusing our attention on the events. We're focusing our attention on circumstances and situations that aren't working for us. And the more we focus on that, the more we tend to attract that. So the fourth key to really living a life of personal responsibility is to make a commitment to no more complaining. So what's on the screen in front of you is really an opportunity over the next few weeks, next few months, and onward, to pay attention and to notice for yourself and for the people in your world, is there blame showing up? Is there shame showing up? Are there excuses being made? And is there a lot of complaining that happens? And if there is, there's an opportunity to shift that, to change your response, to change the way you show up, and start really focus on taking personal responsibility, focus on controlling your response to the events that are happening around you. Now, I want to be clear about the distinction between responsibility and blame, because some people think they're very much the same. When we talk to people about taking 100% responsibility for the results that are showing up in their lives, a lot of times people will go right to a place of blame. If the results that are showing up in their lives right now aren't what they want, they will think that taking responsibility is to blame themselves for that fact, to blame themselves for the fact that things aren't working very well. But the reality is, there's a very powerful distinction between responsibility and blame. If we look backwards in time, if we look at what's led up till now, if we're beating ourselves up for not creating the results that we'd like to have created, that's blaming. Responsibility is looking forward. Responsibility is going from this moment in time forward and really owning the fact that we're going to change our actions, change our thinking, change our beliefs, change our response in some way in order to start getting more of the results that we want. So it's great to take responsibility for what's happened up until now, but not to dwell on it, and to, as quickly as possible, get to that point where we're moving forward. We're looking ahead and looking at changing our responses to what's happening now in order to create more of the results we want as we move forward. So the distinction between responsibility and blame is really whether our focus is on the past and what's happened up until now, or whether we're going to focus our attention on the future and moving ahead and where we want to be and the results that we want to create moving forward. And again, that's what we really mean when we talk about 100% personal responsibility. Again, I said at the beginning that this principle, this idea, this concept is arguably the single most important one for us to mentor and model for our children. If we're committed to our children being prepared to thrive in the high stress, high pressure, and fast changing world that they're headed into, this principle of taking 100% responsibility, not blaming and shaming or making excuses and complaining, is arguably the most important principle that we can model for them. It is the one that will make the very biggest difference. So as we move forward, there's a couple things that we want to do. First of all, I want to share a quick story with you about how this shows up in my own world, how it has shown up in my own world in a really profound way, in a way that ended up making a really big difference for my youngest daughter. My youngest daughter was actually born with an injury that's called a brachial plexus injury. It was a circumstance, a situation, an event, if you will, that occurred at birth for her, where the doctor made a mistake, and she ended up with nerve damage that affects the movement and feeling in her left arm. And this was a huge opportunity for us as a family, for my wife and I, and for my daughter, even for her brother and sister, to make a decision about whether we were going to shift into blame and shame and making excuses and complaining, or whether we were going to take personal responsibility. And we were actually part of a parent support group for parents and families that found themselves in similar circumstances and situations with a birth injury. And what we found was that most families went really quickly into victimhood. They went really quickly into, this isn't fair, it's not right, it shouldn't have happened to me, somebody else made a mistake, and really focusing on the limitations and what was missing and what was wrong and what wasn't fair, rather than focusing on possibilities and what could happen. And my wife and I made a fundamentally different decision, and I think it really had a lot to do with the fact that that we have had the opportunity to be around the kind of work that's embedded in this course. We made a decision based on changing our response to these events and circumstances, made a decision to focus on what our daughter was going to be capable of, what she was going to be able to do, what was possible for her, rather than focusing on her limitations and what she wouldn't be able to do. And to make a long story short, my youngest daughter, who does still have very real and very tangible physical limitations with her left arm, but she has never let that get in her way. She's been very active and playing sports at a very high level. She's been able to achieve academically and socially on a very high level. She's a really great person. She's accomplishing great things. She's currently finished her first year of college at an excellent school, and she's doing really, really well. And I believe that it has a lot to do with the fact that at a very early age, we made a decision, we made a choice to respond to the circumstance, to the situation, to the event that we were faced with called this injury in a way where we really focused on the positive. We focused on the possibilities. We focused not on blaming and making excuses and complaining, but really on what my daughter was capable of and how amazing and wonderful and positive her life was going to be in spite of this circumstance and situation. So for us, it was a really profound example of how important this concept of personal responsibility really is, and how it really hits home, really targets very close to home in this area called parenting, where it's very real and very important that we be willing to embrace this concept of personal responsibility. So as we move forward, I have a couple of invitations for you in terms of ways to implement this concept of personal responsibility into your day-to-day life. A couple of homework assignments. Number one is the next video that's in the series as part of Module 1 is an interactive and experiential exercise that is designed to help you to really experience this concept of personal responsibility in a really deep and really profound way. So I invite you to go quickly to that video, maybe even right after you're done with this one, and give yourself the opportunity to do the interactive exercise that's designed to help you grasp this concept of personal responsibility on an even deeper level. So the first part of the homework is to complete that interactive exercise that's in the next video. The second part of the homework, and this is pretty much always going to be part of our homework from the lessons, is as we get into these conversations, as we discuss a formula like E plus R equals O, as we consider changing our responses rather than focusing on the events, it's important to share these lessons, to share the lessons with the other people in your family, with your spouse, with your children, and begin a conversation. And we're going to say this over and over again, but a lot of these conversations are best entered into with questions. What we don't want to do is take a kind of an I told you so, you need to know this, you're not doing this right kind of approach, but rather engage with questions. Share the material, share the ideas in a way that will make people curious and interested, and most importantly, be willing to model the lesson, be willing to model the information and the insights yourself rather than asking other people to change. So a part of this homework about sharing the lesson is to look at your own life, look for a place that you can be more responsible, maybe a place that you can stop blaming someone else, a place that you can stop blaming yourself, stop shaming yourself about something that you can stop complaining about, or some excuses that you can stop making, and use that as an example when you're sharing the lesson with other people and perhaps inviting them to do something similar. But sharing the lesson, making it an engaging conversation is an important part of what we want you to do with this conversation. And then finally, we invite you in your world, whether it's at home or work or whatever part of your world, just start paying attention through this lens called E plus R equals O. And notice, are you surrounded by people who are willing to take personal responsibility for the results that show up in their lives? Or are you surrounded by people who have a tendency to do a lot of blaming and shaming and making excuses and complaining? They say that we're made up of, our characteristics are very similar rather to the 5 people we spend the most time with. So as you're at work and as you're at home, just pay attention and notice if you're surrounded by people who are themselves willing to take responsibility, and also make part of that observation looking in the mirror. Look at yourself and really make an assessment about how you're doing in this realm of taking personal responsibility. Keeping in mind that most of us have really never been taught this concept and the importance of this concept. We live in the world where it's very normal and in fact encouraged to do a lot of blaming and shaming and complaining and making excuses. It's perfectly normal. It's pretty much what we see around us every single day. Another reason why this principle, this concept is so powerful is when we really start living our lives from taking personal responsibility, from a place of making personal responsibility a part of who we are, we very quickly differentiate ourselves from other people in the world. and again, start moving in the direction of creating the results, the outcomes, the experiences that we really want to be having, regardless of the events and circumstances that are around us. And then the final note on that is, because this is such a big shift for people, I encourage you to be kind to yourself. If you do look in the mirror and you see that this isn't something that you've been doing so well with, give yourself a break. Again, we're all doing the very best we can with the awareness, skills, and knowledge that we have. And this is simply an opportunity to make a shift in the direction of using a strategy that will ultimately work much, much better for you. And be kind to yourself, be easy on yourself. If you do find that there are some digressions or some transgressions, maybe you're not doing so well, you catch yourself not being so good at taking personal responsibility, there's only one way to really ingrain these new behaviors, and that's to continue to focus on them and to be kind to yourself. Give yourself a break if things aren't going so well. And even in that is an event, and it's an opportunity to change your response to the event to create more of the outcomes that you really want. So those are a few things that you can do moving forward, especially that next lesson, the interactive exercise, I think you'll find very valuable. And that'll be the next step in moving forward in the Parent Success Principles course. This course, which is designed to help you prepare your children to thrive in a fast-changing, high-stress, and high-pressure world. Thanks so much for listening in on this video. We will see you on the next video, where we will do that interactive exercise.